Sometimes life strips everything away until all you have left is hope and $3 silver. For Aiyana, an Apache woman in 1885, those coins represented months of backbreaking work and sleepless nights dreaming of a place to call home. The abandoned Adobe on the edge of Copper Ridge was all she could afford. Everyone said it was worthless: crumbling walls, broken beams, and rumors of being cursed. Previous owners had fled in terror, whispering about strange sounds and moving shadows. But when Aiyana pushed open that weathered door, she found something nobody expected. Golden eyes stared down at her from the rafters. A family of eagles had made their home in the ruins. These weren't just any birds. Eagles were sacred to her people, messengers between earth and sky. But why had they chosen this forgotten place? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the desert floor as Aiyana walked the dusty path toward her new home, her grandmother's medicine pouch bouncing gently against her hip with each step. The worn leather pouch, darkened by decades of handling, contained sacred herbs and stones passed down through generations of Apache women. It was all she had left of her family, all she had left of the old ways. Copper Ridge sprawled before her like a wound in the earth, its buildings thrust up from the desert with the stubborn persistence of men who refused to understand the land they conquered. The railroad had carved its iron path through Apache territory 3 years ago, bringing with it a flood of settlers, speculators, and soldiers. Most of her people had been herded onto reservations, their children torn away to boarding schools where they were forbidden to speak their own language or practice their traditions. But Aiyana had slipped through the cracks. At 28, she possessed a fierce independence that both protected and isolated her. While her husband had died fighting the cavalry and her children had been lost to disease in the forced march to the reservation, she had somehow survived on the edges of white society, washing clothes and mending saddles for townsfolk who barely acknowledged her existence. The Adobe sat at the far end of town like a forgotten gravestone. Built of sun-baked clay and timber, it had once been a modest home for some long-departed settler family. Now its walls sagged with age and neglect, its wooden door hung askew on rusted hinges, and its flat roof bore holes that let in both rain and starlight. "You sure about this, Aiyana?" called Martha Henley from her front porch across the street. The middle-aged woman had been one of the few townspeople to show Aiyana any kindness, occasionally offering extra pay for particularly difficult mending work. "That place has been empty for nigh on 2 years. Last family that tried living there packed up and left in the middle of the night." Aiyana paused at the Adobe's threshold, her hand resting on the splintered wooden door. "What happened to them?" Martha glanced around nervously, as if speaking too loudly might summon whatever had driven the previous occupants away. "Strange noises," they said, shadows moving when there was nothing to cast them. The wife claimed she heard voices speaking in tongues she didn't recognize. Husband said it was just the wind, but even he looked spooked by the end. The wind picked up, stirring dust devils in the street and causing the Adobe's door to creak open wider. From somewhere within came a soft rustling sound, like wings settling into rest. "Every place has its ghosts, Mrs. Henley," Aiyana said, pushing the door open fully. "The question is whether they're angry or just lonely." The interior was larger than it appeared from outside, with thick walls that would provide blessed coolness during the scorching summer months. Shafts of sunlight streamed through gaps in the roof, illuminating motes of dust that danced in the still air. The main room held the remnants of previous occupants: a broken chair, scraps of torn cloth, a rusted pot sitting beside a cold fireplace. But it was the sound from above that drew Aiyana's attention. Looking up toward the exposed wooden beams of the ceiling, she saw them, 3 magnificent golden eagles perched in what had once been the home's sleeping loft. The largest, clearly the male, regarded her with intelligent amber eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom. His mate sat protectively near a nest built into the corner of the loft, while a younger eagle, likely their offspring, preened its feathers with careful precision. In Apache tradition, eagles were sacred messengers, bridges between the earthly world and the realm of spirits. To find them here, in this forgotten place, was no accident. They had chosen this sanctuary for reasons that went deeper than simple shelter. Shash, she whispered in Apache, using the word for bear, a term of respect for these noble birds. The male eagle tilted its head, as if acknowledging her greeting. For the first time in months, Aiyana felt something resembling peace. These eagles had claimed this place as their own, had transformed an abandoned ruin into a sacred space. Perhaps they had been waiting for someone who would understand their presence, someone who could appreciate the spiritual significance of their choice. As she moved through the Adobe, examining its basic structure and potential for repair, the eagles watched her with calm alertness. They showed no fear, no aggression, only a careful evaluation of this new presence in their domain. When she approached a pile of debris near the back wall, the young eagle let out a soft call, almost like a warning. Aiyana knelt and began clearing away broken pottery and rotted wood. Beneath the debris, she discovered something that made her heart race. A small section of the Adobe's floor had been deliberately covered with loose stones and dirt. Someone had hidden something here, something they desperately wanted to keep secret. "What were you trying to protect?" she murmured, her fingers tracing the edges of the hidden area. The medicine pouch at her hip seemed to grow warm, as if her grandmother's spirit was trying to communicate across the veil between worlds. The eagles above remained still, watching, waiting to see what ancient secrets would be revealed. Outside, the sun climbed higher, casting the desert in shades of gold and amber. In the distance, a church bell tolled the hour, reminding the world that civilization had planted its flag in this wild place. But here, in this humble Adobe with its eagle guardians, time moved differently. Here, the old ways still held power. The Adobe's thick walls told their own story through scars and patches. Someone had reinforced the structure more than once, adding wooden beams where the original clay had cracked, replacing roof sections that had collapsed under the weight of rare desert storms. Each repair spoke of determination, of people who had refused to abandon this place, despite whatever troubles had befallen it. Near the fireplace, Aiyana found evidence of the Adobe's more recent occupants. A child's wooden toy horse lay half-buried under fallen adobe, its paint faded, but its carved features still visible. A woman's hair ribbon, once blue but now grey with dust, had been tucked behind a loose stone in the wall, perhaps hidden there for safekeeping, perhaps left as a token of blessing for whoever might come next. These small artifacts spoke of ordinary lives interrupted, of families forced to flee, not by Apache raids or outlaw gangs, but by something far more unsettling. The stories Martha Henley had told suddenly carried more weight. What could frighten hard-working frontier families badly enough to make them abandon their homes in the dead of night? The eagle's presence suggested an answer that most white settlers would never have considered. In Apache belief, certain places held spiritual significance that transcended human ownership. Sacred sites, burial grounds, locations where important ceremonies had taken place, all carried power that could manifest in ways white eyes weren't trained to see. Aiyana rose to her feet, decision crystallizing in her mind like morning frost. This place needed her as much as she needed it. The eagles had shown her that some things were worth protecting, worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed impossible. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the $3 silver, her entire fortune, earned through countless hours of backbreaking labor. As she had told the land agent that morning, it was all she could offer. But looking up at the eagles, seeing the way they had transformed this broken place into something sacred, she knew those 3 coins would purchase more than just walls and a roof. They would buy her a chance to honor the old ways, to create a bridge between the world that was dying and the world that was being born. They would buy her a place to belong. The male eagle spread his wings briefly, a gesture that seemed like approval, then settled back into watchful stillness. Aiyana smiled, the first genuine smile she had worn in years. As evening approached, she began the practical work of making the Adobe habitable. The roof needed patching, the door required new hinges, and the floor would need to be swept clean of years of accumulated debris. But first, she needed to understand what lay beneath that carefully concealed section of flooring, working by the light of a small fire she built in the fireplace. Aiyana carefully removed the stones and packed earth that covered the hidden area. The eagles watched her progress with what seemed like approval, occasionally calling out in soft voices that sounded almost like encouragement, whatever secrets this place held. Whatever spiritual significance had drawn both eagles and ghosts to make it their sanctuary, she was ready to become its guardian. The white world had taken her family, her land, and her people's way of life. But here, in this humble adobe where eagles nested and spirits whispered in the wind, the old power still lived, and Aiyana intended to keep it that way. She was home. 3 days after moving into the adobe, Aiyana knelt beside the hidden section of flooring she had discovered, carefully removing stones and packed earth with the reverence of someone approaching sacred ground. The eagles watched from their perch with intense interest, the male occasionally letting out soft calls that sounded almost like guidance. Her fingers closed around something hard and sharp, buried 6 inches below the surface. When she pulled it free and brushed away the dirt, her breath caught. In her palm lay a perfectly crafted arrowhead, its obsidian surface still razor-sharp despite years of burial. But it was the dark staining along its edge that made her stomach clench, old blood, dried to the color of rust. This was no hunting arrow. The craftsmanship spoke of warfare, of a weapon made by Apache hands for battle. But whose blood had it drawn? And why had someone buried it here, in this exact spot where eagles now made their home? The sound of approaching hoofbeats outside broke her contemplation. Aiyana quickly wrapped the arrowhead in a piece of cloth and tucked it into her medicine pouch, some instinct warning her to keep this discovery private. She emerged from the adobe to find Sheriff Tom Bradley dismounting his horse, his weathered face grim beneath the brim of his hat. "Morning, Miss—" He paused, clearly struggling with her name. "Aiyana," she said simply, noting how his hand rested casually on his gun belt. "Sheriff Bradley. Afraid I've got some bad news." He pulled a folded document from his vest pocket. "Got word from the Territorial Land Office yesterday. Seems there's been a problem with the sale of this property." Aiyana's heart sank, but she kept her expression neutral. "What kind of problem?" "Legal irregularities," Bradley said, unfolding the paper. "The man who sold you this place, Jacob Thornton, apparently didn't have clear title. Seems there's been multiple claims on this land going back years, and the Territorial Office is sorting it out now. I paid what was asked," Aiyana said, her voice steady despite the fear rising in her chest. "I have the receipt. I know you did, and I'm sorry about that. But until this gets straightened out, I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to vacate the premises." Bradley's tone was apologetic but firm. "Temporarily, of course. Once the lawyers figure out who actually owns what, we'll know where we stand." From above came a sharp cry from the male eagle, followed by the rustle of powerful wings. Bradley glanced up nervously, taking an unconscious step backward. "Those birds seem mighty protective of this place," he observed. "Eagles are sacred to my people," Aiyana replied. "They don't choose their homes lightly. Well, sacred or not, I need you to pack up your things. You can stay at the boarding house until—" "No." The word came out stronger than Aiyana had intended, surprising even herself. Bradley's eyebrows rose. "Miss, I'm trying to be reasonable here, but this is a legal matter. I can't just ignore an official notice from the territorial government." The wind picked up suddenly, swirling dust around them and causing the eagles to call out in agitation. The younger eagle launched itself from the roof, circling overhead in tight, aggressive patterns. Something about its behavior seemed almost protective. "Sheriff," Aiyana said, choosing her words carefully, "may I ask who filed the competing claim?" Bradley consulted his document. "Company called Copper Ridge Development. They say they have documentation proving prior ownership going back to 1882. The name sent a chill through Aiyana's bones. She had heard whispers about Copper Ridge development, a group of investors from back east who had been buying up land around the railroad terminus, forcing out small homesteaders and Apache families alike. They were the same people who had lobbied for the military campaigns that destroyed her village. And if I refuse to leave? Bradley's face hardened. Then I'll have to remove you by force. I don't want to do that, Miss Aiyana, but I will if I have to. As if summoned by the threat, all three eagles suddenly took flight, their massive wings casting moving shadows across the ground. They circled overhead in a pattern that reminded Aiyana of the war dances her father had taught her as a child. Deliberate, powerful, and unmistakably threatening. Bradley's horse whinnied nervously and shied away from the Adobe, forcing the sheriff to struggle with the reins. "What in blazes—" "They know," Aiyana said quietly. "Know what?" "That this land has already seen too much injustice." She looked directly into Bradley's eyes. "Sheriff, I need 3 days to gather evidence that this property is rightfully mine. Give me that much time." "Evidence? What kind of evidence could you possibly—" A sharp crack interrupted him. Looking toward the Adobe, they saw that one of the wooden shutters had swung open by itself, despite the fact that there was no wind strong enough to move it. Through the window, shadows seemed to shift and move with their own purpose. Bradley's face paled. "I heard stories about this place being unusual, but I figured it was just talk." 3 days, Aiyana repeated. "If I can't prove my right to be here by then, I'll leave peacefully." The sheriff looked up at the circling eagles, then at the Adobe where shadows continued their strange dance. His practical mind was clearly at war with the evidence of his senses. Finally he nodded reluctantly. 3 days. "But if you can't produce some kind of legal documentation by then, I'll be back with a federal marshal if necessary." As Bradley remounted his horse and rode away, the eagles gradually settled back onto the Adobe's roof. But their watchful alertness remained, as if they understood that a battle was coming. Aiyana returned to the spot where she had found the blood-stained arrowhead. There were other secrets buried here. She could feel it in the way the earth seemed to pulse beneath her feet, in the way the eagles watched her every movement with such intensity. Kneeling beside the disturbed earth, she began to dig again. If someone wanted to take this sacred place away from her, they would first have to reckon with whatever truths lay hidden in its foundation. The eagles had chosen this place for a reason, and she was beginning to suspect that reason went back much further than anyone realized. The blood-stained arrowhead in her medicine pouch seemed to grow warm against her hip, as if awakening to the presence of its buried companions. Whatever had happened here, whoever had died here, their story was about to be told. As she worked, more artifacts emerged from the earth, fragments of pottery that bore Apache markings, beads from a broken necklace, and most disturbing of all, what appeared to be human bone fragments, small pieces that could have been from fingers or toes, scattered as if someone had tried to hide evidence of violence. The eagles' behavior grew more agitated as each new discovery came to light. They called to each other in complex patterns that sounded almost like a conversation, their voices carrying notes of sorrow and anger that seemed to transcend ordinary bird communication. By sunset, Aiyana had uncovered enough evidence to know that something terrible had happened in this place. The Adobe hadn't just been built over sacred ground, it had been built over a crime scene. Someone had died here, been buried here, and then deliberately forgotten. The eagles weren't just nesting in this place, they were standing guard over a grave. As darkness fell, Aiyana sat beside her small fire and studied the artifacts she had recovered. Each piece told part of a story of violence and cover-up, of Apache people who had come here in peace and never returned home. The blood-stained arrowhead was just the beginning. In 3 days, she would have to face Sheriff Bradley with proof of her right to this land. But what she had found suggested that the true crime wasn't her presence here. It was the systematic theft and murder that had allowed white settlers to claim Apache territory in the first place. The eagles settled into their roost with soft calls that sounded almost like mourning songs. They were remembering something, honoring something, protecting something that the white world wanted desperately to forget. And Aiyana had just made herself the guardian of that terrible secret. The next morning found Aiyana in the cramped office of the Copper Ridge Telegraph, poring over yellowed newspapers, while the elderly clerk, Henry Moss, watched her with curious eyes. The faded daguerreotype lay before her on the wooden table, the photograph she had discovered hidden within the Adobe's walls after hours of careful searching the previous evening. The image showed a group of Apache warriors, standing beside several white men in military uniforms and civilian clothes. Unlike the typical photographs of the era that depicted Apache as prisoners or threats, this one suggested something entirely different. A peaceful negotiation, perhaps even a treaty signing. The backdrop was unmistakably her Adobe, but in the photograph it appeared newly built, its walls straight and strong. "Never seen anything like that before," Henry admitted, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. "Must be from the early days, before the big troubles started. Can you tell me anything about the previous owners of that Adobe?" Aiyana asked, her finger tracing the faces in the photograph. One of the Apache warriors looked remarkably like her father had in his youth, the same strong jaw, the same proud bearing. Henry scratched his graying beard thoughtfully. "Well, let's see. The McAllister family built it originally, back in 78 or 79. Scottish folks came out with the railroad survey crews. They only lasted about 2 years before they packed up sudden-like and moved back east. Why did they leave? Same reason most folks don't stay in that place long. Strange happenings. Mrs. McAllister claimed she heard voices at night, speaking in what she called heathen tongues. Mr. McAllister was more practical-minded, but even he admitted there were sounds coming from beneath the floorboards that couldn't rightly be explained. Aiyana's pulse quickened. "Beneath the floorboards?" "That's what they said. Like scratching, or maybe digging. Sometimes they'd wake up and find their furniture had been moved around, as if someone had been searching for something underneath the house. The blood-stained arrowhead in her medicine pouch seemed to pulse with significance. Whatever was buried beneath her Adobe, the previous owners had sensed its presence without understanding what it meant. After the McAllisters came the Henderson family," Henry continued, warming to his story. "Lasted even less time, maybe 6 months. Then there was a single fellow, prospector named Pete Galloway. He stuck it out for almost a year before he up and disappeared one night. Left all his belongings behind, never came back for them. Disappeared. Just vanished. Some folks figured he struck out for California, but he left his mining equipment, his savings, even his horse. Wasn't like a man planning to travel." Aiyana studied the faces in the photograph again. The white men appeared to be officials of some kind. Their bearing suggested authority, possibly military or governmental. If this represented a treaty negotiation, there should be records somewhere. "Henry, do you have any newspapers from around 1880 or 1881? Something that might mention treaty negotiations with the Apache?" The old clerk's face grew thoughtful. "Might be something in the back files. Most of the treaty news got reported, even if it was just a paragraph or two. Local folks like to know when there might be trouble brewing." He disappeared into the newspaper's archives, leaving Aiyana alone with the photograph and her growing certainty that the Adobe sat at the center of something much larger than a simple property dispute. After 20 minutes, Henry returned with a stack of brittle newspapers. "Here's what I could find from those years. Most of it's routine stuff, cattle prices, railroad schedules, social notices. But there are a few mentions of Apache delegations coming through town." Together, they spread the newspapers across the table and began searching. Most of the references to Apache were brief and dismissive, focusing on military movements or reservation boundaries. But in a paper dated October 15, 1880, Aiyana found something that made her heart race. The headline read, "Local Peace Talks Show Promise." The article, buried on page 3, described a meeting between Apache leaders and territorial officials to discuss land rights and mineral claims. It mentioned specifically that the negotiations had taken place at a private residence on the outskirts of town. and that both sides had expressed optimism about reaching an agreement. There, Aiyana pointed to the article. That's what the photograph shows, these peace talks. Henry leaned closer, squinting at the text. Says here the Apache delegation was led by someone called War Chief Standing Bear. That name mean anything to you? Aiyana's breath caught. Standing Bear had been her grandfather's war name. She had never known he had participated in peace negotiations with the whites. Family stories had focused on his battles, his resistance to forced relocation. He was my grandfather, she said quietly. Well, I'll be... Henry looked at her with new respect. So you've got actual family connection to whatever happened in that Adobe. The bell above the telegraph office door chimed, and both Henry and Aiyana looked up to see a well-dressed man in an expensive suit entering. He was perhaps 50 years old, with the soft hands and pale complexion of someone who spent his time in offices rather than outdoors. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice carrying the refined accent of Eastern education. "I'm looking for the Apache woman who has been asking questions about property records." Aiyana felt a chill of warning. "I am Aiyana. Who's asking?" The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Franklin Morrison, legal representative for Copper Ridge Development. I understand you've been conducting research into the ownership history of a certain Adobe property. It's a free country, Mr. Morrison. Last I heard, looking at old newspapers wasn't against the law. Of course not. I'm simply here to offer some friendly advice." Morrison glanced at the photograph on the table, and something flickered in his expression. Recognition, perhaps, or concern. "Property disputes can be expensive and time-consuming. My clients are prepared to offer you a fair settlement for any inconvenience you've experienced." "What kind of settlement?" $200 cash. More than enough to establish yourself somewhere more suitable. The sum was enormous, more money than Aiyana had ever seen at one time. But something in Morrison's eagerness to settle made her suspicious. "That's very generous," she said carefully. "Why would your clients pay so much for a worthless Adobe?" Morrison's smile became strained. "My clients believe in resolving disputes amicably. Litigation benefits no one." Henry had been listening to this exchange with growing interest. Now he cleared his throat and spoke up. "Mr. Morrison, if you don't mind my asking, what exactly does Copper Ridge Development plan to do with that property?" "Commercial development. The railroad has brought prosperity to this region, and we believe that property would be ideal for expansion of the town's business district." But Aiyana was studying the man's face, noting the slight tension around his eyes, the way his fingers drummed nervously against his leg. Franklin Morrison was lying and not very well. "I'll need to think about your offer," she said. Morrison's mask slipped slightly. "Miss Aiyana, I strongly advise you not to prolong this matter. My clients are reasonable people, but their patience isn't unlimited." After Morrison left, Henry turned to Aiyana with troubled eyes. "That didn't sound much like friendly advice to me." Aiyana gathered up the newspapers and tucked the photograph carefully into her medicine pouch alongside the blood-stained arrowhead. "No, it didn't, but it tells me we're on the right track." "What do you mean?" He recognized this photograph, Henry. Whatever happened in that Adobe during those peace talks, Copper Ridge Development knows about it, and they're willing to pay a lot of money to keep it buried. As she walked back toward the Adobe, Aiyana's mind raced with possibilities. Her grandfather had been involved in peace negotiations at her future home. Something had gone wrong, wrong enough that people had been killed. Wrong enough that someone had buried a blood-stained arrowhead beneath the floorboards, and now, over 40 years later, someone was still trying to cover up whatever had happened that day. The eagles circled overhead as she approached the Adobe, their calls sounding almost like warnings. But warnings against what or whom? The fragment of treaty document crackled between Aiyana's fingers like ancient skin, its water-damaged edges revealing only tantalizing glimpses of what had once been a complete legal agreement. She had found it that morning wedged deep into the Adobe's chimney, wrapped in oiled cloth that had partially protected it from decades of moisture and decay. The visible portions contained formal language, typical of government documents, hereby granted in perpetuity to the Apache Nation, and mineral rights and water access shall remain, and most intriguingly, in consideration of said nation's assistance in establishing peaceful relations. What kind of assistance? And why had this treaty never been honored? A gentle knock at the Adobe's door interrupted her examination of the document. She opened it to find a young white man in a modest suit, his earnest face bearing the kind of determination that suggested either great idealism or great foolishness. "Miss Aiyana, my name is David Webster. I'm an attorney here in Copperidge. I wondered if I might speak with you about your property situation." Aiyana studied him carefully. After Franklin Morrison's veiled threats, she was wary of any lawyer who showed up at her door. "What kind of attorney?" "The kind who believes the law should protect everyone equally, regardless of their race or station." Webster's voice carried conviction, but also a nervous energy that suggested he was well aware of how unpopular his views might be in a frontier town. "I heard about your dispute with Copper Ridge Development, and I think you may need legal representation. Can you afford to take on a case that might not pay?" Webster smiled. "Miss Aiyana, I didn't come out here to get rich. I came because I believe this territory needs lawyers who care more about justice than profit." Something in his manner reminded Aiyana of the young Apache warriors who had joined her father in the final. Desperate battles against the cavalry, idealistic, brave, and probably doomed. But sometimes desperate causes needed desperate allies. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. Webster entered the Adobe and immediately looked up toward the rafters where the eagles perched. His face showed wonder rather than fear. Magnificent creatures. "I've never seen them nest so close to human habitation. They were here first," Aiyana said. "This is their sanctuary. Perhaps that's significant in a legal sense." Webster set his leather satchel on the rough wooden table. "There are territorial statutes protecting certain wildlife habitats, particularly those with spiritual significance to native tribes." Aiyana felt a spark of hope. "You think that might help?" "It's one avenue to explore. But first, I need to understand the full scope of your claim. Do you have any documentation beyond your purchase receipt?" Carefully, Aiyana showed him the photograph and the treaty fragment. Webster examined both with the careful attention of someone trained to read legal documents, his excitement growing visibly. "This is extraordinary," he breathed. "If this treaty fragment is authentic, and the paper and ink appear to be from the right period, it suggests a formal agreement between the Apache Nation and the territorial government. An agreement that, based on the language, was never ratified or implemented. What would that mean? It could mean the land was never legally available for sale to white settlers in the first place. If the Apache retained rights under this treaty, then all subsequent sales would be fraudulent." Before Aiyana could respond, the sound of multiple horses approaching caught their attention. Through the Adobe's window, they saw Sheriff Bradley riding up with 3 other men. 2 she recognized as local ranch hands who sometimes did enforcement work for the more prosperous landowners. And 1 stranger in expensive clothes who carried himself with unmistakable authority. "Trouble," Webster muttered, quickly gathering up the documents. The stranger dismounted and strode toward the Adobe with the confidence of someone accustomed to having his orders followed without question. He was perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair and the kind of commanding presence that suggested military background. "I am Colonel James Whitman, representing the Territorial Land Commission," he announced without preamble. "I understand there's been some confusion about the ownership of this property." Aiyana stepped outside, Webster close behind her. "There's no confusion on my part, Colonel. I bought this land legally." Whitman's gaze swept over her dismissively before settling on Webster. "And you are?" "David Webster, Miss Aiyana's legal counsel." "Legal counsel." Whitman's tone suggested he found the concept amusing. "Young man, I'm here to inform you that this property has been classified as strategically important to territorial development. As such, it falls under the emergency acquisition provisions of the Territorial Development Act." "I'm not familiar with that act," Webster said carefully. "It was passed by emergency session last month. It allows the territorial government to acquire properties necessary for railroad expansion, mining operations, or other projects deemed vital to regional growth. Aiyana felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. But Webster stepped forward with surprising confidence. "Colonel, even if such an act exists, it would still require fair compensation at market value, and it cannot supersede existing native treaty rights." Whitman's eyes narrowed. "Treaty rights? What treaty rights?" "The treaty negotiated at this very location in 1880, establishing Apache land claims and mineral rights in this area." For a moment, complete silence fell over the group. Then Whitman laughed, a harsh, brittle sound that held no amusement. "There was no treaty in 1880, young man. The Apache in this region were relocated to reservations after their uprising was put down. Any claims to the contrary are pure fantasy." But Aiyana was watching the colonel's face carefully, noting the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his hand clenched and unclenched at his side. James Whitman was lying, and he was nervous about being caught in that lie. From above came a sudden cry from the eagles. All three birds launched themselves from the roof simultaneously, circling overhead in an aggressive pattern that made the horses snort and dance nervously. "Colonel," Aiyana said quietly, "those eagles have been guarding this place for years. They know its history better than any of us, and they know when someone is trying to disturb something that should be left at peace." Whitman looked up at the circling birds with obvious unease. Superstitious nonsense. But Sheriff Bradley was studying the eagles with troubled eyes. "Colonel, I've lived in this territory for 15 years, and I've never seen birds behave like that. It's like they're protecting something." "They are," Aiyana said. "This ground is sacred. It holds the bones of those who died for peace, and their spirits won't rest until justice is done." Webster pulled the treaty fragment from his satchel. "Colonel, perhaps you'd like to examine this document before you make any final decisions about property acquisition." Whitman's face went pale as he recognized the official territorial seal visible on the fragment. His composure cracked completely. "Where did you get that?" "From the Adobe's chimney, where someone hid it over 40 years ago." Aiyana stepped closer to Whitman, noting how his eyes couldn't quite meet hers. "The question is, why was it hidden? What happened to the Apache delegation that came here to sign that treaty?" The eagle's cries grew louder, more insistent. One of the ranch hand's horses reared, nearly unseating its rider. "This conversation is over," Whitman said abruptly. "You have 24 hours to vacate this property. If you're still here tomorrow, you'll be removed by federal marshals." As the group rode away, Webster turned to Aiyana with excitement and concern warring in his expression. "We've struck something important," he said. "But that also means we've made powerful enemies." Aiyana touched her medicine pouch, feeling the treaty fragment and blood-stained arrowhead within. "My grandfather always said that when you start finding the truth, the lies become desperate to stop you." The eagles settled back onto the Adobe's roof, but their alertness remained. They were preparing for battle, and Aiyana realized she needed to prepare as well. Whatever had happened here in 1880, whatever crime had been covered up for over 40 years, someone was willing to use the full power of the territorial government to keep it buried. But the eagles had chosen her to be the guardian of this sacred ground, and she would not fail them. The sacred eagle feather materialized in Aiyana's hand like a gift from the spirit world itself. She had been sitting in meditation beside the Adobe's eastern wall, watching the sunrise paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson, when the largest of the eagles, the male she had come to think of as the guardian, descended from his perch with silent grace. Instead of landing, he hovered before her for a moment that seemed to stretch beyond time, his powerful wings stirring the morning air into small whirlwinds. Then, with deliberate ceremony, he released a single perfect feather from his tail. It drifted down to land in her outstretched palm, its surface shimmering with an inner light that had nothing to do with the rising sun. In Apache tradition, such a gift was granted only to those chosen for sacred duty. The feather marked her as a spiritual warrior, someone entrusted with protecting the balance between the world of the living and the realm of spirits. As her fingers closed around the feather, Aiyana felt a surge of power and responsibility that made her breath catch. The eagles' behavior had been growing more unusual each day. They no longer simply nested in the Adobe's rafters. They patrolled the property with the vigilance of sentries, their keen eyes tracking every movement in and around the building. Yesterday, she had watched them perform what could only be described as a reconnaissance flight, circling the town in precise patterns as if mapping potential threats. More disturbing were the human visitors who had begun appearing with increasing frequency. Since Colonel Whitman's ultimatum 3 days ago, strangers had been seen watching the Adobe from various vantage points around town. Men in dusty trail clothes who claimed to be passing through but whose horses bore no signs of long travel. Well-dressed gentlemen who studied the property through telescopes from the hotel's upper windows. The most unsettling incident had occurred the previous evening, when Aiyana returned from the general store to find clear evidence that someone had attempted to enter the Adobe in her absence. Boot prints in the dust showed where at least 2 men had approached the building. But the prints ended abruptly, just shy of the door, as if the intruders had been turned away by some invisible barrier. Martha Henley had witnessed the incident from her front porch. "Strangest thing I ever saw," she told Aiyana later. "Those men walked right up to your door, bold as brass. But then your eagles started calling, and suddenly both fellows just stopped dead in their tracks. Stood there for maybe a minute, looking confused, before they turned around and walked away like they'd forgotten why they came. Now, holding the sacred feather, Aiyana understood that the eagle's protection extended far beyond the natural world. They were enforcing spiritual boundaries that most humans couldn't even perceive. David Webster arrived mid-morning with news that was both encouraging and alarming. His research into territorial land records had uncovered a web of fraudulent transactions dating back to the early 1880s. Shell companies, forged documents, and bribed officials, all connected to a systematic effort to steal Apache land. "It's bigger than we thought," he said, spreading documents across the Adobe's table while the eagles watched from above with apparent interest. Copper Ridge Development is just the latest front for an operation that's been going on for decades. The same group of investors has been behind every suspicious land grab in this territory. Who are they? That's where it gets interesting. Webster pulled out a photograph, a formal portrait of 5 well-dressed men posed in front of an American flag. These are the founding members of the Territorial Progress Association, formed in 1879. Officially, they're civic leaders promoting economic development. Unofficially, they're a criminal organization that's stolen thousands of acres of Apache land. Aiyana studied the faces in the photograph. One of them was unmistakably Colonel Whitman, though 40 years younger. Another looked familiar, though she couldn't place where she might have seen him. "The interesting thing," Webster continued, "is that 3 of these 5 men died under mysterious circumstances between 1881 and 1883. Natural causes, according to the death certificates, but the timing is suspicious." "What kind of mysterious circumstances?" "Heart failure, stroke, sudden fever. All relatively young men, all previously healthy. And all of them died within months of the last confirmed Apache peace delegation visiting this area." The sacred feather in Aiyana's hand seemed to pulse with warmth. She was beginning to understand that the eagles weren't just protecting her, they were enforcing a justice that went beyond human law. "David, what if those men didn't die of natural causes? What if something happened during those peace talks that someone wanted to cover up permanently?" Before Webster could answer, a commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window, they saw a group of rough-looking men approaching the Adobe on foot, having left their horses 100 yards away. They carried pickaxes and shovels, and their leader, a heavy-set man with a scar across his left cheek, gestured toward the building with obvious intent. "Looks like they're planning to dig," Webster observed grimly. But as the men drew closer, the eagle's behavior became increasingly agitated. All 3 birds took flight simultaneously, their calls growing louder and more aggressive. They began diving at the intruders, not quite making contact, but coming close enough to force the men to duck and stumble. The scarred leader shouted orders, but his voice was drowned out by the eagle's cries. One of his men raised a shovel as if to strike at the diving birds, but something extraordinary happened. The moment he lifted the tool, it seemed to slip from his grasp, clattering to the ground as if yanked away by invisible hands. "What in hell?" the man started to say, but his words were cut off as shadows began moving across the ground in patterns that had nothing to do with the position of the sun. The shadows seemed to be reaching toward the intruders, growing longer and darker with each passing second. The horses, still 100 yards away, began neighing in terror and pulling at their reins. Two of them broke free and galloped back toward town, leaving their riders stranded. "Boss," one of the men called out, his voice shaking, "maybe we should come back later, when those birds ain't around." But the scarred leader was staring at something else entirely. From the Adobe's roof, a fourth eagle had appeared, larger than the others, its feathers so dark they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. This eagle didn't dive or cry out. It simply perched on the roof's edge and watched the intruders with eyes that seemed to burn with an inner fire. "That ain't natural," whispered one of the men. "Eagles don't get that big." Aiyana felt the sacred feather in her hand grow almost hot. Through the window, she could see that the fourth eagle was translucent around the edges, as if it existed only partially in the physical world. This was no ordinary bird. It was a spirit guardian, called forth by the disturbance of sacred ground. The scarred leader tried to rally his men, but the spiritual pressure in the air had become almost tangible. The temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees in a matter of seconds, and the wind began picking up dust and debris in miniature whirlwinds that danced around the intruders' feet. Then, clear as spoken words, a voice seemed to rise from the ground itself, speaking in Apache, but with a power that transcended language. Even the white men could understand its meaning. "Leave this place. Honor the dead. Disturb nothing." The intruders broke and ran, abandoning their tools and racing toward town on foot. The spirit eagle watched them go, then slowly faded from view, leaving only the 3 natural eagles circling protectively overhead. The ancient bone whistle lay nestled in the eagle's nest, like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. Aiyana discovered it during her morning inspection of the Adobe's roof, where she had climbed to repair a section of clay tiles that had shifted during the previous night's supernatural disturbance. The whistle was carved from what appeared to be eagle bone, its surface polished smooth by countless hands and decorated with symbols that made Aiyana's heart race with recognition. These were Apache war markings, specifically the symbols used by scouts and messengers to communicate across long distances during battle. As she lifted the whistle from the nest, the 3 eagles watched her with intense interest. The largest male let out a soft call and bobbed his head, as if encouraging her to try the instrument. When Aiyana raised it to her lips and blew gently, the sound that emerged was unlike anything she had ever heard. Not the simple whistle she expected, but a complex tone that seemed to carry multiple harmonics. Like voices speaking in unison, the eagles responded immediately, their own calls joining the whistle's song in a pattern that was clearly deliberate communication. As the sound carried across the desert, Aiyana realized she was participating in something that hadn't happened for over 40 years. Apache and eagle voices, joined in the ancient language of the sky. "Fascinating," came David Webster's voice from the ladder he had just climbed to join her on the roof. "Is that some kind of ceremonial instrument?" "It's a scout whistle," Aiyana explained, turning the carved bone in her hands. "My father told me stories about warriors who could speak with eagles during battle, using whistles like this one. I always thought they were just legends. Perhaps not." Webster was studying the eagles with newfound respect. "I've been doing more research into your grandfather's delegation. According to military reports I found in the territorial archives, the Apache who came here in 1880 included several war chiefs known for their abilities to work with trained eagles as scouts and messengers. The implications hit Aiyana like a physical blow. They brought war eagles to the peace talks? It makes sense from a strategic standpoint. If they were venturing into potentially hostile territory to negotiate, they'd want every advantage, including aerial reconnaissance. Aiyana looked at the three eagles perched around the nest, seeing them with new eyes. These weren't just any birds who had chosen the Adobe as their home. They were the descendants of the war eagles who had served her grandfather's delegation, still maintaining their ancestral duty as guardians of this sacred place. The bone whistle felt warm in her hands, as if awakening to her touch. When she blew another experimental note, the eagle's response was immediate and complex, a series of calls and movements that conveyed information she couldn't quite interpret, but somehow understood at a deeper level. "They're telling me something," she said. "Something about danger approaching." Webster looked toward town, where a cloud of dust was rising from the main street. "Riders coming." A lot of them. Through the dust, they could make out a column of mounted men, easily 20 or more, approaching the Adobe at a steady pace. At their head rode Colonel Whitman, but now he was flanked by men in military uniforms and others who carried themselves with the unmistakable bearing of professional gunfighters. "Federal marshals," Webster observed grimly. Whitman made good on his threat. But as the riders drew closer, the eagle's behavior suggested this was more than a simple eviction. All three birds took flight, circling high overhead in the scouting pattern Aiyana was beginning to recognize. Their calls had changed from communication to warning, sharp, urgent cries that carried across the desert like alarm bells. Using the bone whistle, Aiyana attempted to respond to their warnings. The sound that emerged seemed to activate something in the eagle's behavior. They began flying in tight formation, diving low over the approaching riders, and then returning to circle the Adobe in increasingly agitated patterns. "What are they saying?" Webster asked. Aiyana listened to the eagle's calls, her grandfather's stories about warbirds suddenly taking on new relevance. "They're saying these men aren't here for arrest. They're here for murder." As if to confirm her interpretation, the approaching riders split into two groups. Half continued toward the Adobe, while the others spread out to surround the property. A tactical maneuver designed to prevent escape rather than facilitate legal proceedings. "David, we need to get down from here," Aiyana said urgently. "Now!" They climbed down quickly, but before they could reach the ground, gunshots erupted from the approaching riders. The bullets weren't aimed at them, they were aimed at the eagles. "No!" Aiyana cried out, but the ancient birds were too experienced in warfare to be caught off guard. They scattered and dove, using the Adobe's walls and roof as cover, while maintaining their protective formation. Colonel Whitman's voice boomed across the distance. "Miss Aiyana, you have 5 minutes to surrender yourself and turn over all documents related to this property. If you refuse, we'll take this Adobe apart stone by stone until we find what we're looking for." Webster grabbed Aiyana's arm. "We can't fight armed marshals. We need to—" "Those aren't marshals," Aiyana interrupted, studying the approaching men through the window. "Look at their uniforms. They're not matching. And see how they're positioned. This is a military assault, not a legal proceeding." The bone whistle in her hand seemed to pulse with urgency. Without thinking, she raised it to her lips and blew a long, complex note that her grandfather's blood somehow knew how to make. The sound that emerged was the Apache war cry she had heard in childhood stories, the call that summoned warriors to battle. The response was immediate and overwhelming. From every direction, eagles began appearing in the sky, not just 3 or 4, but dozens of them, their wings darkening the morning sun as they converged on the Adobe. These were the spiritual descendants of every war eagle that had ever served her people, called back from whatever realm the dead inhabit to honor their ancient oaths. "Impossible," Webster breathed, staring up at the aerial army gathering overhead. But Aiyana was no longer surprised by impossible things. The bone whistle had awakened something that had been sleeping for 40 years. The spirits of Apache warriors who had died believing in the possibility of peace, only to be betrayed and murdered by the very men they had trusted. Colonel Whitman's men began firing wildly at the eagles, but their bullets seemed to pass through many of the birds without effect. These were spirit eagles, immune to earthly weapons, but capable of striking fear into the hearts of guilty men. As the eagles dove and wheeled overhead, Aiyana felt the presence of her grandfather standing bare, settling around her like a protective cloak. The time for hiding was over. The time for justice had come. The bone whistle grew warm in her hands, and she knew that the final battle for the sacred ground beneath her feet was about to begin. The silver cavalry button gleamed in Aiyana's palm like a piece of captured moonlight. Its metal surface tarnished, but still bearing the unmistakable eagle and shield of the United States Army. She had found it buried deeper than all the other artifacts, wrapped in a scrap of blue military cloth that had somehow survived 40 years underground. But it was what the button represented that made her blood run cold. "David!" she called, her voice tight with dawning horror. "Look at this." Webster hurried over from where he had been reinforcing the Adobe's windows against the approaching assault. When he saw the button, his face went pale. "That's from a cavalry officer's uniform. What was it doing buried with Apache artifacts?" Aiyana turned the button over in her hands, noting the manufacturer's mark stamped into the back. "This isn't just any cavalry button. Look at the design. It's from a dress uniform, the kind officers wore to formal occasions, ceremonies, treaty signings." The implications crashed over them both like a cold wave. The peace talks hadn't been disrupted by Apache violence or even by civilian land grabbers acting alone. The United States Army itself had been involved in the massacre. The military was supposed to be guaranteeing safe passage for the delegation, Webster said, his legal mind racing through the ramifications. If Army officers participated in murdering Apache negotiators under a flag of truce, it wasn't just murder, Aiyana interrupted, her grandmother's memories suddenly flooding through her consciousness with startling clarity. It was treason. The Apache delegation came here under military protection, guaranteed by the federal government. Someone in the army broke that oath and killed them for it. Through the window, they could see Colonel Whitman's force drawing closer, their weapons now openly displayed. But something about their formation struck Aiyana as oddly familiar, too organized, too military for a simple land eviction. She raised the bone whistle to her lips and blew a questioning note. The eagle's response was immediate and agitated, their cries carrying a note of recognition that chilled her to the bone. "They remember," she whispered. "They remember the uniforms, the formations. These men, or men exactly like them, were here 40 years ago." Webster stared at the approaching riders with new understanding. "Whitman's not just covering up a land grab. He's covering up military involvement in the massacre. That's why he has so much authority, why he can mobilize federal marshals on short notice." The bone whistle seemed to grow heavy in Aiyana's hands as more memories surfaced. Not her own memories, but those of her grandfather standing bare, somehow preserved in the sacred ground beneath their feet. She could see it now, as clearly as if she had been there. Apache warriors dismounting at the Adobe in good faith, their war eagles perched nearby. Army officers in dress uniforms greeting them with false smiles and hidden weapons. The treaty was real, she said, her voice carrying the weight of generational betrayal. My grandfather and the territorial officials had actually reached an agreement. The Apache would keep mineral rights to their ancestral lands in exchange for allowing railroad passage and joint mining operations. A fair compromise, Webster murmured. Too fair for some people. Aiyana closed her fist around the cavalry button. The military had been promised exclusive mining contracts as payment for their service in the Apache wars. If the Apache retained mineral rights, those contracts would be worthless. The Eagle Army overhead began calling out in complex harmonies, their voices carrying across the desert like a battle song. But this time, Aiyana could understand what they were saying. They were naming names, the officers who had betrayed their oaths, the soldiers who had fired on sleeping Apache negotiators, the commanders who had covered up the massacre and blamed it on Apache aggression. James Whitman was there, she said with sudden certainty. Not as a colonel, he was young then, maybe a lieutenant or captain, But he was there when they killed my grandfather. As if summoned by the mention of his name, Whitman's voice boomed across the desert. Miss Aiyana, this is your final warning. Surrender the documents and vacate the premises, or face the consequences. But Aiyana was no longer listening to threats. The cavalry button had unlocked something deeper than memory. It had awakened the spiritual connection between the living and the dead that the Apache had always known existed. She could feel her grandfather's presence as clearly as if he stood beside her, his war eagle perched on his shoulder, his eyes burning with righteous fury. "Tell him," Standing Bear's spirit whispered in her mind. "Tell him we remember what he did. Tell him the dead demand justice." Aiyana walked to the Adobe's door and threw it open, stepping into the desert afternoon with the bone whistle in one hand and the cavalry button in the other. The eagles overhead immediately shifted their formation to provide aerial cover, while spiritual pressure built around the Adobe like the gathering of a supernatural storm. "Colonel Whitman," she called out, her voice carrying farther than it should have been able to. "I know who you are. I know what you did here in 1880. The approaching riders slowed, their horses growing skittish as the supernatural energy in the air intensified. Whitman himself had gone pale, his military bearing faltering as he stared at the button in Aiyana's raised hand. 40 years ago, you were Lieutenant James Whitman of the 7th Cavalry," she continued, each word hitting him like a physical blow. "You were assigned to provide security for the Apache peace delegation. Instead, you helped murder them in their sleep and bury their bodies beneath this very ground." "That's impossible," Whitman called back, but his voice lacked conviction. "The Apache attacked first. They broke the truce. The only thing broken here was your oath as an officer," Aiyana replied. "The only truce violated was the one you swore to uphold." She raised the bone whistle to her lips and blew a long, mournful note that seemed to awaken every spirit that had ever walked this desert. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Ghostly Apache warriors began materializing around the Adobe, their spectral forms becoming more solid with each passing moment. But they weren't alone. Other spirits were gathering too, the ghosts of the 2 white officials who had been murdered alongside the Apache delegation, their ethereal forms still bearing the wounds that had ended their lives. "Judge Matthews," one of them spoke, his voice carrying the authority of territorial law. "Commissioner Hartwell," said the other, "we who died for peace demand justice for peace." Whitman's remaining composure shattered completely. Several of his men wheeled their horses and fled, unable to bear the spiritual pressure building around the Adobe. Those who remained seemed frozen in place, their weapons useless against enemies who had already died once and could not be killed again. "What do you want from me?" Whitman cried out, his voice breaking with 40 years of suppressed guilt. "What can I possibly do to undo what's already done?" "Confess," Standing Bear's spirit commanded, his presence now visible even to the white men as a towering figure in war paint and eagle feathers. "Speak the truth you have hidden. Name the others who shared your guilt. Let the world know what really happened in this place." The cavalry button in Aiyana's hand began to glow with its own inner light, and she understood that the final reckoning had begun. The dead would not rest until justice was done, and the living would not escape until the truth was told. Above them all, the Eagle Army wheeled and cried, their voices raised in songs of justice too long delayed. War paint pigments in clay jars had emerged from the earth like ancient memories made manifest. Aiyana discovered them buried beneath the loose stones where she had first found the blood-stained arrowhead, their mineral contents still vibrant despite decades underground. Red ochre, yellow clay, charcoal black, and the sacred white chalk, all the colors her ancestors had used to prepare for spiritual battle. As she knelt beside the small cache of jars, the eagle's calls overhead took on a different quality, not warning now, but encouragement. They understood what she was preparing to do, what role she was accepting in the cosmic balance between justice and injustice. David Webster stood guard at the window, watching Colonel Whitman's men establish a perimeter around the Adobe. "They're not attacking yet," he reported. "Looks like they're waiting for something." "They're waiting for nightfall," Aiyana said, mixing the pigments with water from her medicine pouch in the traditional way her grandmother had taught her. "They plan to attack under cover of darkness, burn the Adobe, and claim we died in an accidental fire while resisting arrest." The eagle army overhead had grown to nearly 100 birds, their formation shifting and changing in patterns that spoke of military precision. They were no ordinary eagles. Some appeared translucent, others seemed to flicker in and out of existence, and a few bore the spectral wounds of ancient battles. These were the war eagles of every Apache band that had ever fought to protect their homeland, called back from the spirit world by the bone whistle's cry. "How can you be so calm about this?" Webster asked, his voice tight with tension. "Because I understand now what my grandfather was trying to achieve." Aiyana began applying the war paint to her face in the traditional patterns, red and black lines that marked her as a spiritual warrior, white dots that signified her connection to the eagle spirits. He came here in 1880 believing that peace was possible, that the Apache and the whites could share this land without bloodshed. She paused in her painting, looking toward the window where the last light of day was fading behind the distant mountains. But the men who met him here had already decided that peace was too expensive. It would mean honoring treaties, respecting Apache rights, sharing the mineral wealth they'd discovered in these hills. So they murdered him. They murdered the entire delegation, 15 Apache leaders, including my grandfather, along with their war eagles and the 2 white officials who had been negotiating in good faith. Aiyana's voice carried the weight of generational grief. They buried the bodies, destroyed the evidence, and told the world that the Apache delegation had simply disappeared. Webster absorbed this revelation with growing horror. But the other officials, the territorial government, must have known what happened. Some of them were part of the conspiracy. Others were told that the Apache had attacked and killed the negotiators before fleeing back to the mountains. It was easier to believe than the truth. As full darkness settled over the desert, torches began appearing around the Adobe's perimeter. Whitman's men were preparing for their final assault, confident that they could eliminate the last witnesses to their 40-year-old crime. But they had underestimated the power of spiritual justice. Aiyana completed her war paint and stood, the bone whistle in one hand and the sacred eagle feather in the other. Through the Adobe's windows, she could see ghostly figures beginning to materialize in the desert, Apache warriors in traditional dress, their spectral forms becoming more solid with each passing moment. "My grandfather's delegation," she whispered. "They'd been waiting all this time for someone to call them home." The spirits were gathering around the Adobe in a great circle, their presence causing the temperature to drop and the wind to pick up in ways that had nothing to do with natural weather patterns. Among them, Aiyana could see her grandfather standing bare, his proud bearing unchanged by death, his war eagle perched on his shoulder like a living flame. At the same time, something unprecedented was happening in the town of Copper Ridge. Martha Henley had been the first to notice the strange lights emanating from the direction of the Adobe, but she wasn't alone for long. One by one, townspeople began emerging from their homes and businesses, drawn by an inexplicable compulsion to witness whatever was about to unfold. "It's like the whole desert's holding its breath," Martha murmured to her neighbor. Both women standing in their nightgowns on the front porch, staring toward the supernatural light show surrounding the Adobe. The local pastor, Reverend Thomas, had tried to dissuade his congregation from venturing out into the night. But even he found himself walking toward the edge of town, his Bible clutched in trembling hands. Whatever was happening at the Adobe had awakened something in the very soul of the desert, something that demanded witness. Back at the Adobe, Aiyana could feel the weight of approaching destiny settling around her like a ceremonial robe. The war paint on her face seemed to pulse with its own life, connecting her to every Apache warrior who had ever stood against injustice. The clay jars that had held the pigments now lay empty before her, their purpose fulfilled. "David," she said quietly, Whatever happens tonight, promise me you'll tell the world what you've learned. Promise me this story won't die with us." Before Webster could answer, an extraordinary transformation began taking place around the Adobe. The ghost warriors who had been gathering in the desert started to become more solid, more real. Their war paint gleamed in the torchlight. Their weapons, spectral though they were, caught and reflected the firelight like genuine steel and stone. The eagles overhead began to glow with their own inner radiance. Their feathers transformed into living flame that hurt to look at directly. They were no longer simply birds. They had become the physical manifestation of Apache spiritual power, messengers between the world of the living and the realm of the ancestors. Colonel Whitman's voice boomed across the darkness, but now it carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. "Last chance, Miss Aiyana. Surrender now or we'll take you by force." Aiyana walked to the center of the Adobe and knelt on the exact spot where she had first discovered the blood-stained arrowhead. As her knees touched the earth, she felt a connection spark between herself and every soul who had died in this place. Not just Apache, but the white officials who had been murdered for trying to make peace. The bone whistle in her hands began to warm, and when she raised it to her lips, the note that emerged seemed to shake the very foundations of the world. It was the death song of warriors, the mourning cry of mothers, and the battle hymn of the righteous, all rolled into one perfect, heartbreaking sound. The response from the spirit world was immediate and overwhelming. Apache warriors began manifesting not just around the Adobe, but throughout the desert, their numbers growing until they rivaled the stars overhead. Among them walked the spirits of every native person who had ever died defending their homeland, not just Apache, but Navajo, Comanche, and dozens of other tribes whose names had been nearly forgotten. But most shocking of all were the other spirits who began to appear, white settlers who had been murdered in the false flag raid staged to justify the military campaigns. Soldiers who had died believing they were fighting honorable wars, only to discover in death that they had been used as pawns in a larger conspiracy. "My God," Webster breathed, staring out at the supernatural army gathering in the night. "How many people died because of this cover-up?" "Thousands," Aiyana replied, her voice now carrying harmonics that seemed to come from multiple throats. "The lie they told about my grandfather's delegation breaking the peace treaty was used to justify decades of warfare. Every person who died in those conflicts is here tonight, demanding justice." Through the window, they could see Whitman's men backing away from the Adobe, their horses wild with terror. The spiritual pressure in the air had become so intense that several of the mercenaries had already fled into the night, abandoning their weapons and their pay rather than face the supernatural army arrayed against them. The war paint on Aiyana's face began to glow with its own light, and she felt the presence of her ancestors flowing through her like a river of liquid fire. She was no longer just herself. She had become the vessel through which generations of Apache voices would finally be heard. "Are you ready?" Standing Bear's spirit asked, his presence now so strong that Webster could see him clearly. Aiyana nodded, rising to her feet with the bone whistle clutched in her painted hands. "I'm ready." The final battle for the soul of the desert was about to begin. Above them all, the Eagle Army let out a collective cry that echoed across the territory, like the voice of justice itself, calling all who would hear to bear witness to the reckoning that was 40 years overdue. In the town of Copper Ridge, every person who could walk had now gathered at the edge of the settlement, their faces turned toward the supernatural light emanating from the Adobe. They didn't understand what they were seeing, but they knew with certainty that they were witnessing something that would change everything. The time for lies was over. The time for truth had come. The Thunderbird feather crown materialized on Aiyana's head like a blessing from the spirit world itself, its magnificent plumage blazing with otherworldly fire that cast dancing shadows across the Adobe's walls. Each feather was perfect, gleaming with colors that existed nowhere in the natural world. Deep purples that held the mystery of twilight, golds that captured the essence of sunrise, and blacks so profound they seemed to contain the wisdom of eternity. As the crown settled onto her brow, Aiyana felt the full weight of her ancestral heritage flowing through her. She was no longer just a displaced Apache woman fighting for a piece of land. She had become the living embodiment of her people's struggle for justice, the voice of every warrior who had died believing in the possibility of peace. Colonel Whitman's remaining men, perhaps 8 of the original 20, found themselves backing away despite their training and experience. The supernatural pressure radiating from the Adobe had become so intense that their horses were rearing and screaming, several breaking free to gallop wildly into the desert night. "This ends now," Whitman shouted, but his voice cracked with fear. He drew his sidearm with a shaking hand, pointing it toward the Adobe, where Aiyana stood silhouetted in the doorway, the Thunderbird crown blazing above her painted face. The climactic confrontation began when Aiyana stepped fully into the desert night, her war paint gleaming in the supernatural light, the bone whistle raised to her lips. The note that emerged was the ancient Apache battle cry, a sound that had struck fear into the hearts of enemies for countless generations. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The spirit army that had been gathering in the darkness suddenly became fully manifest, their ghostly forms solidifying into an otherworldly war party that surrounded Whitman's remaining force. Apache warriors in full battle regalia stood shoulder to shoulder with the spirits of murdered white officials, all united in their demand for justice. "You cannot kill what is already dead," Aiyana called out across the desert, her voice carrying with preternatural clarity. "And you cannot bury the truth forever." Whitman's men opened fire, their bullets striking the spirit warriors and passing harmlessly through their ethereal forms. But the eagles overhead were not so easily dismissed. The aerial army dove as one, their talons and beaks targeting the living men with supernatural precision. "Fall back!" One of the mercenaries screamed, but there was nowhere to retreat. The spirit circle had closed completely around them, and the eagles controlled the sky above. Through the chaos, David Webster emerged from the Adobe, carrying the treaty fragment and photograph, his face pale but determined. "Colonel Whitman," he called out, "you're under citizen's arrest for conspiracy, murder, and treason against the United States government." Whitman laughed, a broken, desperate sound that echoed strangely in the supernatural atmosphere. "Arrest? By whose authority?" "This is Apache witchcraft." "By the authority of the Treaty of 1880, Webster replied, holding up the fragment. "A legally binding agreement that was signed before these murders took place. An agreement that makes this Apache land, and makes your presence here, an act of war." The spirit warriors moved closer, their forms becoming more solid with each step. Standing Bear's ghost took the lead, his war paint glowing with otherworldly fire, his spectral war eagle perched on his shoulder, with eyes that burned like stars. "James Whitman," the spirit spoke, his voice carrying the authority of the grave. 40 years ago you violated every code of honor that a soldier swears to uphold. You murdered men who came here in peace, trusting in your word." Whitman's remaining composure began to crumble. "We had orders. The railroad consortium, they paid for those contracts. We couldn't let a handful of savages. Standing Bear's spirit interrupted, his presence growing more imposing. "We came here to negotiate a peace that would have benefited both our peoples. You repaid our trust with murder." The Thunderbird crown on Aiyana's head blazed brighter, and when she spoke, her voice carried the power of all her ancestors. "Tell them, grandfather. Tell them what really happened that night." Standing Bear's spirit nodded, his form becoming so solid that he cast a shadow in the firelight. "We had agreed to share the mineral rights, Apache knowledge of the land combined with white mining techniques. Both peoples would have prospered. But greed poisoned the hearts of men like you. The railroad needed clear title." Whitman cried, desperation making his voice shrill. "Investors wouldn't put up money for joint ventures with Indians. It was business. It was murder." The spirit of Judge Matthews interjected, his ghostly form appearing beside Standing Bear. Commissioner Hartwell and I were there to witness the treaty signing. When we realized what you planned to do, we tried to stop it and died for your honor, Aiyana said, the Thunderbird crown pulsing with each word. While he, she pointed at Whitman, lived 40 years in shame. The bone whistle in her hand seemed to call out on its own, summoning more spirits from the vast desert beyond. Apache warriors from a dozen different bands began manifesting, along with the ghosts of settlers who had died in the false flag raids, soldiers who had been deceived into fighting unjust wars, and children, both Apache and white, who had lost their lives to the violence that followed the breakdown of peace. Whitman fell to his knees, overwhelmed by the spiritual pressure surrounding him. His remaining men had either fled or lay unconscious, overcome by forces beyond their understanding. "What do you want from me?" he whispered. "I can't bring them back. I can't undo what's been done." The Thunderbird crown blazed with final authority as Aiyana prepared to speak the words that would seal his fate. The ancestral talking stick materialized in Aiyana's hands like justice made manifest. A carved wooden staff adorned with eagle feathers, bear claws, and sacred stones that caught the firelight and threw it back in patterns that hurt the guilty to look upon. As her fingers closed around the ancient wood, she felt the voices of her ancestors flowing through her. Generations of Apache leaders who had spoken for justice and died for peace. "I'm no longer just Aiyana," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to come from multiple throats. "I am the voice of Standing Bear, of Swift Arrow, of Morning Star, and all who died in this place seeking peace with those who offered only betrayal." Colonel Whitman cowered on his knees, his remaining men scattered and demoralized by the supernatural forces surrounding them. The spirit warriors had formed a circle of judgment, their ghostly presence so powerful that even the natural world seemed to acknowledge their authority. The wind had died to perfect stillness, and the stars above burned with unusual brightness. "James Whitman," Aiyana spoke with the talking stick raised high. 40 years ago, you led 15 Apache leaders into ambush under the flag of peace. You murdered them as they slept, trusting in your word. You buried their bodies and their war eagles beneath this very ground. You destroyed a treaty that would have brought lasting peace to this territory. Do you confess these crimes?" Whitman's face was streaked with tears, his military bearing completely shattered. "Yes," he whispered. "Yes, I confess. We killed them all. We had to. They wouldn't agree to the new terms. The railroad consortium had offered too much money to let a handful of Apache warriors stand in the way. "Speak the names of your accomplices," the talking stick commanded. Aiyana's voice, now clearly carrying the authority of multiple spirits. Morrison, Franklin Morrison, the lawyer. His father, William Morrison, was the territorial administrator who authorized the operation. Thomas Bradley, Sheriff Bradley's older brother, he led the assault team. Harrison Wells, the railroad representative. And, his voice broke completely, Judge Robert Matthews and Commissioner Samuel Hartwell. They weren't supposed to die. They tried to stop us when they realized what we intended. We couldn't let them live to expose us. David Webster, forgotten in the supernatural drama, frantically scribbled down every word of the confession. This was evidence that would not only clear Aiyana's claim to the land, but expose a conspiracy that had corrupted territorial politics for decades. The spirit of Standing Bear stepped forward, his war paint glowing with otherworldly fire. "And what of the children, James Whitman? What of the Apache families you told us would be safe if we came here to talk peace?" Whitman's sobs shook his entire body. "The raids. We staged Apache raids on settler families to justify the military campaigns that followed. We used captured Apache weapons, Apache horses. Made it look like your people had broken the peace first. How many died because of your deception? Hundreds, maybe thousands. Apache families on the reservations, settler families in their homes. All because we needed the war to continue long enough to steal the land legally." The talking stick pulsed with power, and Aiyana felt the weight of generational justice flowing through her. "James Whitman, your crimes cry out from the earth itself. The spirits of the dead demand retribution. The spirit circle began to close around the kneeling colonel, their otherworldly presence making the air itself seem thick and heavy. But as they drew near, Standing Bear raised his ghostly hand in a gesture of restraint. "Wait," the spirit leader commanded. "This man's death would only add to the darkness that has poisoned this land. There is another way to balance the scales of justice." Aiyana felt the talking stick grow warm in her hands as her grandfather's wisdom flowed through her. "James Whitman, you have a choice. You can die here tonight, your secrets buried with you, and face whatever judgment awaits in the spirit world. Or you can live to bear witness to the truth you have hidden for 40 years. Whitman looked up at her through tear-streaked eyes, his voice barely a whisper. "What do you want me to do?" "Sign a full confession," Webster interjected, understanding the spiritual justice being offered. "Name every conspirator, living and dead. Testify before a territorial court about what really happened here. Make sure the world knows the truth." The spirit of Judge Matthews stepped forward, his ethereal form radiating the authority he had held in life. "And more than that, James Whitman, you will ensure that this land is permanently protected as a sacred site. You will use whatever influence you still possess to see that the Apache people receive the mineral rights that were promised in the original treaty. But the consortium, the investors, they'll have me killed if I expose them." Standing Bear's spirit laughed, a sound like wind through canyon stones. "You think the living pose a greater threat than the dead. You think mortal men are more dangerous than the spirits you have wronged." The Eagle army overhead began to settle on every available surface around the Adobe, the roof, the walls, the desert floor. Their presence was so overwhelming that the very air seemed to vibrate with supernatural power. "Choose quickly," Aiyana commanded, the talking stick blazing with final authority. "The spirits grow impatient and dawn approaches. In the light of day, this offer will not be repeated." Whitman looked around at the circle of ghostly warriors, at the eagles whose eyes burned with otherworldly fire, at the ancestral talking stick that pulsed with the accumulated justice of generations. When he spoke, his voice was that of a broken man accepting his fate. "I'll sign whatever you want. I'll testify to everything. Just please let me make this right." The spirit circle began to disperse, their forms growing translucent as justice was finally served. Standing Bear approached his granddaughter one last time, his presence warm and proud. "You have done well, granddaughter. The sacred ground is protected, and the truth will be known. Our spirits can rest now." As the first light of dawn touched the eastern horizon, the supernatural army faded into the morning mist, their duty finally complete. The eagles settled into peaceful formation around the Adobe. No longer the fierce warbirds of the spirit world, but simple guardians watching over their ancestral home. Aiyana removed the Thunderbird crown and set down the talking stick, feeling the weight of her spiritual burden lift from her shoulders. The battle was over. Justice had been served, and the sacred ground beneath her feet was finally truly safe. The eagle nest protection deed lay spread across the rough wooden table of the Adobe, its official seals and signatures marking the transformation of a forgotten ruin into a legally protected Apache spiritual sanctuary. Aiyana traced the formal language with her finger, marveling at how $3 silver had ultimately purchased not just a home, but justice itself. 6 months had passed since that supernatural night when the spirits of her ancestors had finally found peace. The territorial court proceedings had been unlike anything in frontier legal history. Colonel Whitman's full confession, corroborated by the documents Webster had uncovered, had exposed a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. The trial had drawn reporters from as far away as San Francisco and Denver, all eager to document the story of the Apache woman who had used spiritual warfare to uncover a 40-year-old military cover-up. But Aiyana found herself less interested in the newspaper attention than in the quiet transformation that had taken place in Copper Ridge itself. The last of the mineral rights paperwork came through. "Yesterday," David Webster announced as he climbed. down from his horse outside the Adobe. His law practice had grown considerably since the trial, with Apache families across the territory seeking his help to reclaim stolen lands. The Apache Nation now holds clear title to mineral extraction rights on over 50,000 acres. Aiyana smiled, watching the eagles circle peacefully overhead. There were still 3 of them, the same family that had first welcomed her to this place, but their behavior had changed completely. No longer did they patrol with military precision or cry out warnings of approaching danger. They nested, they hunted, they raised their young in the natural rhythm of birds who no longer carried the spiritual burden of guarding murdered souls. What about the railroad consortium? Bankrupt, Webster replied with satisfaction. When the truth about their fraudulent land acquisitions came to light, investors pulled out faster than you could blink. The territorial government seized their remaining assets to compensate the Apache tribes for decades of stolen resources. The Adobe itself had been carefully restored, but not in the way most frontier buildings were improved. Instead of removing all traces of its tragic history, Aiyana had chosen to preserve the evidence of what had happened here. The hidden burial ground beneath the floorboards had been properly excavated and consecrated, with the remains of her grandfather's delegation given full military honors by the same army that had once betrayed them. A small memorial now stood. Beside the Adobe, 15 stone markers bearing the names of the Apache leaders who had died seeking peace, along with monuments to Judge Matthews and Commissioner Hartwell. Eagle feathers adorned each grave, and the bone whistle that had summoned the spirit army now rested in a place of honor at the memorial center. "I brought someone to meet you," Webster said, helping an elderly Apache woman down from his wagon. She moved slowly but with dignity, her gray hair braided with eagle feathers and her weathered hands carrying a bundle wrapped in ceremonial cloth. "This is Maria Crowfeather," Webster explained. "She's Standing Bear's great-niece, your cousin. She's come from the reservation to see what you've built here." Aiyana felt her heart skip as she looked into eyes that held the same proud spirit she remembered in her grandfather's ghostly form. Maria studied the Adobe, the memorial, and the eagles overhead, with the careful attention of someone trained to read spiritual signs. "He is at peace now," Maria said finally, her voice carrying the quiet authority of an elder. "I have not felt his spirit walking the earth for many months." "You have done well, cousin." "I had help," Aiyana replied, gesturing toward the eagles. "They never forgot their duty, even after 40 years. Maria nodded, unwrapping the bundle she carried. Inside was a magnificent eagle feather headdress, not the supernatural crown that had appeared during the spiritual battle, but a real one crafted by human hands with love and reverence. "This belonged to your grandfather," she explained. "I have kept it all these years, waiting for the right person to carry on his legacy. I believe that person is you." As Aiyana accepted the headdress, she felt a connection to her heritage that went beyond the supernatural experiences of recent months. This was the tangible link to a proud people who had never stopped fighting for justice. Even when the odds seemed impossible, the territorial governor has agreed to establish this as an official Apache cultural center, Webster continued. "Apache families will be able to come here for ceremonies, vision quests, and to teach their children the old ways." Already, word was spreading throughout the Apache communities. Families who had been scattered by forced relocations were beginning to make pilgrimages to the Adobe, drawn by stories of the spiritual battle that had restored their rights and dignity. The place that had once been a site of betrayal and murder was being transformed into a symbol of cultural renewal and spiritual strength. Martha Henley appeared from across the street, carrying a basket of fresh bread and her usual warm smile. In the months since the trial, the townspeople of Copper Ridge had gradually come to terms with the dark history that had been hidden beneath their feet. Some had left, unable to live with the knowledge of what their prosperity had cost. Others, like Martha, had chosen to stay and help build something better. "Figured you'd be hungry after your journey," she said to Maria, setting the basket down on the Adobe's table. We've got a town meeting tonight to discuss the new school curriculum. The children should learn about what really happened here as the sun began to set over the desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Aiyana stood in the doorway of her Adobe and reflected on the journey that had brought her here. $3 silver had seemed like such a small sum when she first counted them out to the land agent. But they had purchased something far more valuable than property. They had bought the opportunity to honor the dead, protect the sacred, and build a bridge between the world that was dying and the world that was being born. The eagles settled into their evening roost with soft calls that sounded almost like lullabies. They were no longer spirit warriors or supernatural guardians. They were simply magnificent birds who had chosen to make their home in a place where justice had finally been served. And in that moment, as the desert night settled around them with its ancient peace, Aiyana knew that her grandfather's dream of harmony between peoples was not dead. It lived on in this sacred place, in the children who would learn the true history of their land, and in the eagles who would continue to soar above it all, guardians of a justice that could never again be buried beneath lies.